This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shenlin. Our guest today is a senior lecturer in sociology and anthropology at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, and the author of a new book entitled Memory Activism, Reimagining the Past for the Future in Israel-Palestine, recently published in English by Vanderbilt University Press. Dr. Yifat Gutman, hello and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. I want you to start out by explaining to us, what is this memory activism thing? It's kind of a new concept in academia and in activism around political conflicts. And here we are in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What is the idea of using memory as an activist tool?
So memory activism, the way I define it, is using cultural practices or cultural memory practices for political change. That's the activism part. So memory activists seek to influence people's views regarding present problems, but they do so using the past, or they hope that a new understanding of the past would bring a new understanding of the present, and they propose a new vision for the future.
What's wrong with how we look at the past?
I mean, the past is always looked at from the present. So it's constructed socially. Even the most personal memories are, at least memory scholars argue, are social. So they're socially constructed and they're very much framed by the present. The groups we're members of, the time, the space, very much also instrumentally mobilized through present interests and groups.
But of course, these present issues aren't separate from the past. I mean, there are present hardships that started somehow in the past. So addressing them would be some sort of healing process that would address the present problems. It's basically looking, as the subtitle of your book says, it's looking at the past for the future.
Right, but it is, as always, memory is mobilized for some purpose, or often it's mobilized for some purpose, and usually we think of it as mobilized by the ruling elites and helping them kind of fortify their power. But here I argue that memory can also be mobilized as a weapon of the weak, or at least those who work for or support the weak. So there are different ways of connecting the past to the present and in line with some sort of projected future that seems to unfold from this past and present. And this is the trick or the mobilization that can be done on both sides, by the state and also by counter-hegemonic activists. So memory as a counter-hegemonic tool for political change.
Okay, I think I want to still try to bring this down to what it means in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and context. Why do you say that the way we remember the past in Israel-Palestine what is it lacking? How does it fortify the elite, as you put it? What service is it being put to the way it is now? And then we can talk about how a different kind of memory of the past is intended to change it with which particular narratives. Mm-hmm.
So the temporal framing of how we view the past in the official or dominant or hegemonic view is related to the Zionist narrative. And this narrative goes, the past is the biblical Holy Land, the homeland of Jews wherever they are, and you bypass the exile or diaspora and you go to the new Hebrew community in Israel and the state of Israel. But some places and times are given less attention. I mean, the lives of Jews as minorities among non-Jews in the diaspora for many years in many places. So the connection here is from the biblical past to the present of settling in Israel again and for a future of greater settlement, or in any case, a Jewish state, an independent Jewish state, the return of Jews to their homeland. Whereas other narratives could talk about what's missing here, or could be post-national, for example, or could be looking at human rights or at lifting national borders and looking at a Middle East that is characterized by friendly relations and successful, economic exchange. I mean, at a regional lens.
In your book, you focus on a specific type of memory activism, that a specific type of memory that's supposed to bring back to life the sort of marginalized and erased history of this piece of land, namely the Palestinian society that lived on this land up until the Nakba. I mean, this is also a central episode in the process that you're describing in your book. But these kinds of memory activist practices are fairly new in the context of Israel and Palestine. We're talking about in this century alone, over the past 15, 20 years. What can you tell us a bit about this, the emergence of this kind of activism in the dynamic of the conflict and activism in Israel and Palestine in general?
So this took place in a specific context in a time that seems the most unlikely for this to happen. So post-Oslo, I'm talking about a story that has a beginning in the year 2000. The three groups that I followed formed around 2000. And this was a time in which the peace camp, so-called after Oslo, where they didn't succeed in bringing peace, looked for a new strategy. Some of it went along with Barak and the no-partner argument, moved further to the center and maybe to the right. But some of the left went further left, and especially the civil society or the activist groups sought after a new activist strategy.
We're talking about Jews and Arabs,
Jews
right?
and Palestinians, citizens, and after the what was called the coexistent industry, or the face-to-face meetings among Jews and Palestinians. This was very popular during the 90s, during the Oslo process, and was very well funded by American foundations.
And Norwegian.
Yeah.
No, European in general.
European,
yeah. But specifically the Norwegians put a lot into those. I mean, the European governments and the Norwegians and the Americans. Mm-hmm. It was written into the Oslo Accords that they were supposed to invest actually in coexistence programs.
Anyway, we're digressing here. Go on.
And then from this meeting face-to-face and trying to come to some sort of a consensus, so building trust among the two rival national communities through consensus in small meetings, this has failed. With Oslo, they sought out and they found a one-sided strategy in which Israelis acknowledge the suffering or the past wrongs Israelis caused Palestinians. And this is a very different and much more contested strategy. So along these lines, and following the criticism given to these coexistence meetings, the previous ones, they sought for new strategies that would involve a one-sided acknowledgement and also more direct actions.
What do you mean by a one-sided acknowledgement?
That Israelis are the ones who have to acknowledge the suffering, the asymmetrical suffering or the asymmetrical past wrongs they caused to Palestinians, instead of some sort of a symmetrical exchange of acknowledgements.
Which was what characterized the dialogue groups in the 90s?
Yeah,
and
the Oslo
agreement
itself.
Mm.
And I think what many of our listeners who are Israeli or, hear the Jewish-Israeli narrative on this will ask is, why did it have to be asymmetrical? What was wrong with the symmetrical approach? I mean, there's two sides of a conflict. They're both hurting each other. They've both suffered. Why do we need this one-sided approach in the narrative of these activists?
So these activists argue that the face-to-face meetings did not touch on justice, and Oslo in general only was interest-based, so very pragmatic. How we're going to solve the conflict, looking to the future and kind of diminishing the past. And they thought this was the reason why it failed, both the peace camp and the agreement. And so they said, we didn't mention 48. We talked with Palestinians, but we were talking about 67, and they were talking about the wrongs from 48.
I think it's interesting that, I think many Israelis notice that the issue of 48 seems to have become a bigger part of the discourse around the conflict in the last decade or maybe decade and a half. Would you say that is partly starting from the processes you're talking about?
I think the activism is actually some sort of a mounting of this process that started, as I think Rafi Netzangot wrote, from the 70s even, but further became more known since 87 with Benny Morris's publication and other new historians and critical sociologists also debating on the pages of Haaretz. In the 90s, there was more room for this kind of criticism. A lot of Zionist myths were broken. But in the 2000s, imagine that period, post-Oslo, Second Intifada, no partner. So many things going on that talking about 48 and also being critical about 48 was not as, not that it was as that acceptable before, but it was marginal, but even more marginalized.
So it seems to me like, in a way, an intra-Jewish and intra-Zionist debate. And when we look at the three groups that you explore in your study, one of them is predominantly Jewish and other two are predominantly Palestinian. Can we really lump them together for the purposes of this study? Because they are coming from very different places. They want to influence the debate in a very different way. And they're also addressing a very different audience.
So there are three groups. Indeed, Zochrot is the largest one, although it's, again, not, these are all fairly marginal circles. So this is a group that was formed by and for primarily Jewish Israelis in 2001. And a second group is All Palestinian, and All Palestinian Youth Association Baladna, operating in different localities where there's a larger population of Palestinians within Israel. And the third group is a bi-national Israeli and Jewish, Israeli and Palestinian group of artists in Jaffa called Autobiography of a City. And indeed, all of these groups do adopt this one-sided acknowledgement model or a strategy, but it is different for Jewish Israeli activists and for Palestinian activists to engage in this activity. As you mentioned, they come from very different places and they have very different stakes. Obviously, Palestinian activists here have much higher stakes dealing with Nakba memory, with the long silence Nakba memory. So for Jewish Israeli activists, it's kind of easier to see how this would be for reconciliation. They seek everyone to first learn, so spread the knowledge on the Palestinian life before 48 and their fate in the 48 war, the Nakba, the displacement, the loss, etc. After the knowledge would be spread, then acknowledgement would follow according to this model. It's a truth and reconciliation model, followed by taking responsibility. However, this is done outside state channels, so it's kind of against the state. So they did spread the knowledge, but acknowledgement and responsibility did not follow. But again, for Jewish Israelis, we can see how this would be a step of trust building, reconciliation, and etc. But for Palestinian activists, how is this reconciliation? So from the interviews that I did with them, and again, as a Jewish Israeli, I was more of an observant than a participant observant when I was talking to Palestinian activists, but still I got some insight that outsiders would get and insiders might not. So it was a very interesting subject position. But in any case, what they said about knowledge, acknowledgement, responsibility was that they would hope that some sort of an official commission, an official Truth and Reconciliation Commission would give them the recognition of the state. And this would be an act of reconciliation for them, symbolic, but still. So this is why they put a record of the Nakba. Is that really
what sets apart this specific context from other sort of memory activism in conflicts that have been resolved, and therefore even the authorities in a way are engaged in this kind of reconciliation process? I mean, is this really why Israel and Palestine is different from, South Africa?
It's not a post-conflict society. I think this is my critique of, this is my question always about transitional justice. It is a model that's been put into place in post-conflict environments. Can it be relevant before the conflict is actually resolved?
Or even more, doesn't it exacerbate conflict dynamics on the ground?
So this is exactly what I wanted to find out. First of all, it does travel. So the model of truth and reconciliation travels, and it is adopted by activists in unintended places, so not post-conflict and outside state channels. I mean, how can this even take place? What is the meaning of transitional justice before the transition and outside state channels? So who would commit the reform, the redistribution of resources and the official commemoration and so on and so forth, and even the hearings, the public hearings that are part of Truth and Reconciliation commissions. But this travels and it goes and shapes the vocabulary and the claims of both activists and victims or those who suffered state violence or past wrongs, and also the government. So the language of what was before transitional justice called historical justice also shaped the two governments, what the Israeli and the Palestinian government argued after Oslo. They also moved in a way from this mutual acknowledgement of past wrongs as a solution, or as escorting the solution to the conflict, to a demand that the other side would first and foremost acknowledge my own historical right for the land. This, of course, is a one-sided step that's done to continue the conflict. Exactly. I mean, as you mentioned, to not to reconcile, but to make it further fortify the rival positions in a zero-sum game.
So let's talk about that. What was the response? Let's say the government, authorities, but also general mainstream society. I mean, there's a lot of backlash that you write about. Describe some of the reactions to this kind of awakening of the narrative of the Nakba.
So at the beginning, because it was such a unlikely context or counterintuitive idea to even talk about 48 in such an escalation in the conflict and violence and separation between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, there wasn't much attention. So going on tours and listening to a testimony by a refugee, which sounds very contested, was not, and about 48 tours of ruins of pre-state villages, Palestinian villages, was not as contested ahead of time. People who went on these tours were not everyone, but still they didn't know exactly what was there. And at least Zochot didn't know what responsibility yet meant. They knew they want to spread the knowledge through tours, so not through political actions such as protests, national flags and signs and so on and so forth.
Don't they have a political program?
Then they went with spreading the knowledge, acknowledgement, but what responsibility would be, they didn't know. Whereas from 2008, at least, the responsibility is advocating for the right of return, which is, of course, extremely contested. So
it came in stages?
So it came in stages. And so these marginalized groups, but especially, I think, Zochot, became very threatening, basically proposing some sort of a ethical commemoration of the other or the ultimate other, while their own national community is under threat. This is, again, a live conflict or an active conflict. So they became very marginal, contested. They were raided by the police. But the most, I think, disproportional or harsh reaction is, of course, the Nakba law, which they see as success, as a reaction. Zochot, does as a reaction to kind of airing this silenced past and contested.
Well, that was
past.
my question. I mean, was this considered sort of a terrible thing, or like any publicity is good publicity when nobody's been talking about the Nakba for the last 60 years?
No, but it seems like, I don't know, my observation is that 15 years ago, very few people knew what the Nakba was.
That's what I'm saying. Is it really good that there's just more publicity, even if it's...
So for them, they have some sort of or some of them express some sort of a deterministic feeling that you cannot, put the genie back in the bottle. Once you air the contested past and it's out there, the critical voices are out there, the Palestinian memories are out there, and you can go back.
Well, I'd like to ask you also about another critical voice that made a lot of splash at the time, which was the far right-wing group called Im Tirtzu, and they had this campaign that maybe some of us remember that was loosely translated. My listeners will excuse me for quoting the campaign. It was called Nakba Bullshit. What do you think was the impact of that? It's now 5 or 6 years later, I think. Was that also, any publicity is good publicity, or do you think that Israeli audiences would say, I believe Im Tirtzu and I don't believe Zochot?
So I think, first of all, that memory is always a side of struggle. So it's never, even you have the Memorial Days calendar of the state, it's still, you have to activate it. It's not going to last, just by the hegemonic power of the state. It can't be static. It's always, in any case, a side of struggle. And so there were a lot of reactions, such as Im Tirtzu publishing this booklet with this title that you quoted.
She doesn't want to say it again.
And also the protests in front of the Nakba Day Memorial outside of Tel Aviv University and other universities. But I think that these reactions, and again, primarily the law, are disproportional, but they show the stakes, or they show how even a marginal memory or an attempt to disseminate this marginal memory, how threatening it is. So it is telling about what is the struggle about, or what are the stakes in airing the possibility that Palestinians are also own this land and they belong to this land or that's what they feel, etc.
I want to go back to the early practices, memory practices that you also describe in your book, before that shift towards more political advocacy and, having a more full-fledged political program. One thing that really struck me is really the way that Zochrot handled this yet amorphous memory activism, and that is by appropriating practices that were predominantly Zionist ones, like Yediat Haaretz, actually going on hikes, which is something that we Israelis are encouraged to do from a very young age. And I mean, this is a long-standing Zionist tradition, and turned it on its head. Well, can you tell us more about it?
Sure. So using culture instead of the traditional political repertoire, the repertoire of political protest, the protests, the flags, the shouting, the megaphone, everything. So they use culture, which brings a level of depoliticization. And this is needed or can help first when the discursive arena is very limited. It is constructed before Oslo, but even more after Oslo, as a zero-sum game of two rival narratives, Israeli and Palestinian, which are mirror narratives. I mean, they actually oppose each other and they leave no room. I mean, you have to take sides. There's no room to do anything else. So they stepped back from that. But the second thing is when you approach maybe every Israeli, but certainly educated Israelis, and you present a clearly ideological stance, they might step back. I mean, they might reject it as propaganda because they're constantly pushed to take a political stance. Are you with us or against us? I mean, on the conflict. So going to touring, going to testimonies, practices that, as you mentioned, are central in the Israeli hegemonic popular culture, was depoliticizing and lowering defenses that might block people from even learning before taking a stance, but even learning about the life of Palestinians.
It was a conscious decision, or was it just what they knew how to do, so they just did it?
I mean, Eitan Bronstein, who is co-founder of Zochrot, described it as first something he did. I mean, that he founded Zochrot while touring, that he used to tour, and then he discovered some ruins of, by the way, villages from 67, not 48. And through touring, which he liked as an Israeli, as a kibbutz member, just kind of discovered the knowledge and went on. But later on, this practice became more conscious, and even in later years, it was institutionalized. So Zochrot also had organized a course for tour guides of Nakba ruins and also issued this app, iNakba, with which you can tour. So it became much more intentional and institutionalized. It's hard to say what came first. I mean, it's probably both intuitive and strategically.
But I think what's interesting about it is that it sounds like, in a way, they were doing things that are part of the Israeli culture and not challenging directly the political authority, which makes it sound like they were trying to create a sort of, low intensity, even a dialogue kind of with Israeli society. But we think of them, Zochrot is perceived as one of the most radical groups out there. Is there no low intensity way to discuss this issue?
So it's funny, again, in the first years it wasn't as contested, and then touring, which you do for free, they don't demand anything from you, you don't need to join anything, you don't need to pay, you just go on a bus. The bus leaves you at a parking lot of a regular national park with many other Israelis on Saturday morning, and you tour, but you go on a different path. So, and the format of this activist touring is more or less identical or very similar to how we tour in, the army and the family weekend tours and so on and so forth. So basically this is some sort of a way to move back, open to some new knowledge at least.
But conversely, on a more ideological plane, I would say that many Israelis would see Zochrot and these other memory groups as having entirely subscribed to the Palestinian narrative. What they want to do is unveil the hidden Palestinian history and also enact a policy that is entirely 100% one-sided, as Israelis would say, to the Palestinian side. I mean, of course, the right of return is something that only Palestinian demands, and for Israelis is a big taboo. Doesn't it really draw a line, a limit to the scope and the extent of their activism?
You mean to drawing different audiences other than a very limited audience? I mean, yes, and their audience, to begin with, even when they weren't as contested, was a self-selected one. But people did have to travel some sort of a distance to move to discussing 48 instead of 67. So this was, again, a process in the Jewish-Israeli, I don't know if to say mind or public debate or discourse. But they have a post-national view of things, and they also learned this Truth and Reconciliation model from meeting with activists in post-conflict areas. Their foundations, their European foundations, trained them and through them they met with other activists. So their mindset is very different than how we, within this active conflict, within our national community, view these things. I mean, they think that the Zionist narrative was kind of hijacked other possibilities, and the other possibilities is to live in friendly relationships with Palestinians. And in many ways, the future they envision goes back to a different narrative of what happened before 48.
Well, I'm curious. One of the things that stood out to me is that you examine all Israeli groups. You have Palestinian Israeli organizations, you have Jewish Israeli organizations. I feel like there's somebody missing at the table. What about Palestinians in the Palestinian territories? After all, that's where the conflict really is. Could it be that you can only really do this kind of memory activism, again, even if it can work in conflict societies? Israeli and Palestinian citizens don't really live in an active, violent conflict. Tensions, yes. Discrimination, yes. But maybe this kind of memory activism is better when the general society is somehow functional as opposed to the active conflict with the Palestinians. Is that the reason? Or is there another reason?
You're right that I don't study, again, from my subject position, I don't study memory activism in the territories, only pointing to it. There was a surge in this activism around 98 within Israel, but of course outside of it and in the territories and also around the world. But in a way, what's interesting here for me in adopting the post-conflict model of truth and reconciliation is that some argue that Palestinians who are citizens are in a way in a post-conflict position. They oppose, of course, because they say the spirit of the martial law hunts us. I mean, it could come back. And
let's just remind our listeners that Palestinian citizens of Israel in many areas in the country lived under martial law until 1966.
Mm-hmm. Right. So this could come back. Our citizenship is not a guarantee, and we feel the threat all the time. But if you argue that they are, in a sort of way, they're citizens, right? They're second-hand citizens, but they have citizenship and they vote. So in a way, a post-conflict in, let's say, South Africa is expanding the franchise. And this has happened here after 48. So it is interesting how this, in some sort of a maybe more possible situation, doesn't work. I mean, instead of working. But of course, if you look at the active conflict within Israel and outside Israel, or between the two camps of governed non-citizens, it becomes much more complicated.
Would you say that this has taken over, really, left-wing activism in Israel at the moment? I mean, there are hardly any dialogue groups going on anymore. Is this really the new flagship of left activism in Israel, memory activism?
No, I don't think so. I mean, with memory activism, the worry that memory will take over activism, but memory here is so contested that it's always a political discussion, and it constantly brings you back to the current public debate and political discourse. No, I think that other activist groups engage with direct action. I mean, Anarchists Against Defense. I mean, I don't think so that memory activism took over. And there were a lot of critical views of memory activism and talking about 48 with the urgency of talking about 67. I mean,
so people didn't
going
want it to diminish.
48, was also taking maybe from the more urgent need of Palestinians in the territories right now.
I really want to ask you one question about the government reaction in terms of how we shape our national narrative, because, of course, one of the main forums for shaping national consciousness about the past is education. And you have a portion where you describe how they tried to implement different textbooks that go through all the narratives after some of this memory came to light. And you walk through the reaction of Likud Minister Limor Livnat, Yuli Tamir from Labor, and Gidon Sa'ar, who was Education Minister and might very soon be a rising star in Likud politics. Can you talk about the reactions of some of the education ministry's policies about these dual narrative textbooks?
So the textbooks, which I kind of only bring as a background to the general wave of academics, revisionist historiography, activism, and artistic and literary endeavors. So the education and textbooks are, of course, extremely important. And you see in other countries the concern, not only with a transition, but also generally the concern that critical voices might, first of all, tear us apart, damage our solidarity, or all kinds of arguments and claims. So this is one of the major battlefields, and it is an institutional battlefield. So some have more power than others. But still, there was an alternative book by Palestinian scholars and educators to the 100 Zionist terms that was at the time studied. So there is also a struggle there to counter the official view of how history and civics should be studied.
But was there a difference between the ministers from Likud and the ministers from Labor?
Yeah, I think so. It's just that the labor minister was such a long time ago that it's hard to remember. But yes, certainly. And also you see with the Nakba law and the attempts to enforce it, how things are escalating. So now it had a chilling effect, the Nakba law, but it turned, I think, to some sort of a censorship tool. It cannot yet be used, but if the means to enforce it would change, then we would be at a totally different level of talking about the past and the present.
All right. Dr. Yifat Gutman, a senior lecturer in sociology and anthropology at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, and the author of the new book, Memory, Activism, Reimagining the Past for the Future in Israel-Palestine. Thank you very much for joining us today. And
also a big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. We have more than 300, I think close to 350 interviews now, and I recommend listening to all of them. Like us on Facebook. Our Facebook page is called the Tel Aviv Review, Ideas from Israel, and follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.